Hi everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this webcast entitled The Perspectives on Employment from Individuals with Multiple Sclerosis. This webcast is sponsored by the RRTC on employment of people with physical disabilities at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I'll be taking you through it today. My name is Matt Bogenschutz, and I am from the VCU School of Social Work, and I'm also a research affiliate with the RRTC. I want to briefly begin by sharing some basic facts about MS in the United States and employment of people with MS in the United States. So prevalence estimates vary, but the best ones that we can find say that there are about 450,000 people with MS living in the United States. And the number has been steadily rising over the last 50 years or so. So we're seeing more and more people being diagnosed with MS and living with MS. That makes the employment of people with MS even more important. So about 3/4 of the people who have MS are female, which is quite a differential, much more than we would see for most conditions. We also know that about 59% of those people who are living with MS are unemployed. That's a very, very large number. And very interestingly, that number is stable whether you're looking at the numbers globally or just in the US. So 59% of individuals with MS do not currently have work. That's in sharp contrast to how people with MS see themselves. The vast majority of people with MS think that they can be working, think that they have the skills to work, and have the desire to work. So we need to do something to make those numbers better, and we're hoping that this study can shed some light on how people think about improving that. We also find that the majority of people with MS, when they ask for workplace accommodations, are dissatisfied with how their employers respond to their requests. So again, this goes kind of hand in hand with that unemployment statistic. Many people get frustrated with how their employers respond to their requests for accommodations and leave the workforce as a result. We can also get some clues about employment of people with MS from the RSA 911 database, which tracks vocational rehabilitation outcomes throughout the country on a year-by-year basis. We know that of the 6,865 cases that were reported in the RSA 911 database in the period 2011 to 2013, that about 29% of them were closed in status 26, which means that there was a successful job outcome. That means that 7 out of 10 leave the VR system without obtaining employment successfully. Furthermore, we know that the average weekly earnings for people who were closed out in status 26, a successful outcome, the average weekly earnings is only about $440. So that's not great money to live on, and that is borne out in some of the comments that we received from our participants in this study, that if they do find employment, it's not oftentimes enough to live on. So this study that I'm going to share today is part of a larger study about what people with disabilities, widely speaking, find about their employment experiences. The study is called Identifying What People with Physical Disabilities Want and Need to Know About Employment. So this has been a national focus group study. It's been ongoing for over a year now. And we have different subgroups. So previously we taped a webcast about spinal cord injury. Today you'll hear about multiple sclerosis. Forthcoming, you'll hear about cerebral palsy. We had a group of people with other disabilities, non-specific. And we also have a group of transition age youth. So altogether, these compose the first part of our large 3-part study. And we definitely want to acknowledge our partners who have helped with the recruitment for the study. Those include the World Institute on Disability, the National Council on Independent Living, United Spinal Cord Injury Association, and the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, which was particularly helpful, as you might imagine, with recruitment for this particular study. Okay, hopefully you can see this okay. I know the text is very, very small, but we wanted to share with you a little bit of information about our participants with MS. So these are the participants specific to this portion of the study that I'm going to be sharing with you today. In the last two columns, that's our unemployed group. The two columns in the middle are the employed group, and the columns on the left-hand side are our demographic characteristics. So you can see here that in terms of age, we're pretty widely spread, which is good news because we know that people with MS come from all different age ranges. That's really consistent with national trends demographically. In the sex category, you can see here that we're also pretty consistent with national trends. We have far more women than men, and that's consistent with the fact that 3/4 of people with MS are women. In terms of race, the sample is fairly white. That's very typical in this kind of research. But we were happy to see that, at least among the unemployed group, we had a good representation among African Americans as well. People in this group were relatively more educated than we would expect in the general population. So that's one potential limitation to the study, is the fact that we are overrepresented on folks who have advanced degrees. Okay, I think that this next category is very important. The years since MS onset. This is one spot where we're going to see differences between the employed group and the unemployed group. The unemployed group has had their MS active in their lives for relatively longer than the employed group. So that would suggest that as MS tends to have greater effects over time, the people also tend to become unemployed over time. So that's a fairly important thing to note. And the participants, by and large, those who are working, make pretty good money from work. We have very good representation there, as you see, in the 50 to 75,000 category. So that's in ways good news. That people can continue to productively work, make decent money, even after the onset of MS. So this was a focus group study, which means that we did group interviews with people with MS. We divided the groups into some groups of people who were employed at the time of the study, and some groups that were people who were unemployed at the time of the study. The reason for this is that we think they have different experiences, and so we asked them different questions, which I'll share with you in just a moment. So as it was a focus group, there were some very strict guidelines that we had to follow. We were very, very careful about confidentiality. We, at the onset of each focus group, made a big point of making sure that the participants understood that whatever was said in the focus group stayed in the focus group, and it was not to be taken outside. This was a national study, so oftentimes we had people from all different regions of the United States on the same call. So the chances of people knowing each other were fairly slim. Nevertheless, we wanted to do everything we could to make sure that people realize the importance of confidentiality. They were conducted telephonically through a toll-free access line. This is sometimes controversial when I've presented this research in the past. The best practice nowadays is to do it via Skype or Google Hangouts or some other video platform, because the thinking is that that will yield richer data. However, we were concerned that that would exclude a lot of folks. We had some people from very, very rural areas where internet access may be difficult. We heard from some people that they had to travel 30 minutes to a library in order to access the internet. So in order to keep it as accessible as possible, we wanted to open it up via telephone instead of making people rely on the internet. Okay, I should also note that the same person did all of the interviews for this study, which was really good for consistency. Okay, as I mentioned before, we had different questions for people who are employed versus people who are unemployed. So I'll start with the unemployed group because that represented more than half of our sample. So we had 12 core questions. I'm not going to go through all of them because that would be relatively boring. I'll just kind of hit the high points. So we asked people what their ideal job would be. And this was a very telling question that most people were fairly realistic in their abilities and sometimes said that their ideal job before the onset of their MS would be different than their ideal job now. We talked about what supports or services, that's people, agencies, et cetera, were useful to them as they looked for a job. We asked about job services or people who are particularly helpful in finding a job. We talked about people who weren't particularly helpful and ways in which they could be more helpful. And we talked about what information a person would really need in order to successfully find a job. We found oftentimes that people were lacking in information, and that was a huge hindrance to them finding work. So that's for the unemployed folks. For people who are employed, we had 13 core questions, many of them the same as for people who are unemployed, but we also focused in on some more specific things about how they found employment. So we talked about what a person does and what their typical day looks like. We talked about the steps that the person took to find their job and was successful in helping them navigate through the workplace and the interview process. We talked about key factors of getting into a job. For example, if a person could really prove that they had the skills needed to do the job, then they oftentimes got the job. How their disability affected them finding a job, and how a person overcame the challenges of their MS to navigate through the workplace. So we really focused on what worked for the person, for the people who are employed, as kind of a how-to in terms of how to navigate through the workplace for other people to learn from. So getting into our analysis procedure. In qualitative research, your analysis procedure is very, very important. So I want to share a little bit of what we did in order to arrive at our results. So we did all of our analysis in NVivo 10, which is a software program that's specifically designed for qualitative analysis. We use what's called a conventional qualitative content analysis approach. If you can say that 3 times fast, you're doing better than I am. So the content analysis approach is an offshoot of grounded theory, which you may have heard of. It allows the researcher to remain very open to the text and to multiple interpretations of the text. So it's very much reliant on data to emerge directly from the text. And in this case, the text was transcriptions of the focus groups. So it's considered to be fairly user-friendly, although it's still a very involved process. So we took basically 3 stages. In the first stage, we used open coding. We remained completely open to the data and coded anything that emerged that seemed to be of interest. So this resulted in a ton of codes and a ton of room for analysis. In the second round, we tried to organize those codes into a hierarchy. So in the next slide, you'll see kind of our overall hierarchy of themes. And this is what emerged from the data as we analyze. So we have very high themes and then subservient themes underneath them. And then the final round, the third round, we really tried to define and refine those themes a little bit. Not a little bit, a lot bit. So we really tried to bring that hierarchy to fruition so it could be really real. And so each one of these 3 phases of analysis was really important and important for different reasons. So we really could not do the analysis without all 3 phases, which makes for a very arduous process, but also a very real and grounded process. All right. So getting on to the findings. You can see here, this is the the overall schematic of our findings, and we'll talk about these things individually as well. So we found that our employment of people with MS really came down to how they face future uncertainty, how they experience a feeling of loss, and how they navigated the workplace. So these are really complicated, and I think mostly it'll make more sense as we go through individually. But you'll notice here that feeling a sense of loss and facing uncertainty, those are both very emotive things, and that's one of the hallmarks that I want to point out. Compared to other groups, for example, the SCI group, we found that dealing with MS tends to be a very emotional process, and it takes a large emotional toll. So you can see here that two of our categories are really kind of focused on that part of MS. Okay, in terms of facing future uncertainty, whether they're currently working or not, we found that most of the participants in our study, they knew that their disease was going to progress over time, and they knew that their disability was going to become more acute over time. So this created a lot of uncertainty. It led people to turn down promotions. It led people to withdraw from the workplace. It was really a big thing, and it's part of the emotional toll that we're talking about. So people made their career decisions not only based on their current standing, but based on what they thought their future ability might be. And this was particularly acute for people who were facing cognitive challenges. As we know, a large portion of people with MS do face cognitive challenges as part of their disability. And we found that those cognitive challenges were particularly salient as people looked at decisions towards their future. Okay, being that this is qualitative research, we think that the participants' words speak volumes. And so I've extracted 3 quotes here to illustrate some of our ideas about facing future uncertainty, and I'm just going to read them to you. So there were dream jobs within my company, but they required 25% travel and being out of town for extended periods of time. And I didn't think I would be able to handle something like that. So knowing that I had MS just prevented me from pursuing my true passion, right? So this quote really illustrates the way in which people look towards the future in making their job decisions. They would turn down promotional opportunities. They would turn down an opportunity to follow their passion because they knew that in 5 years from now, they would be unlikely to do the travel. At the bottom here, I have more issues in how I think and process at times. Not all the time. Today I'm actually having a stellar day. But the last job I had, I would just screw up so much stuff and people would be looking at me like, so now I'm looking at me, right? So here we can see that the participant is really questioning their own ability to do the job. They're realizing they are having some struggles. They're making more and more mistakes as the cognitive issues become more salient, and they just realize they can't do the work anymore. And on the side, I feel unfortunately like I have a career shelf life. Like I can only go so long without being able to be home permanently. That's always kind of in the back of my mind. Again here, facing future uncertainty, not knowing what the future holds in terms of the individual's abilities, and that weighs very, very heavily on how they think about their career over the long term. Okay, somewhat relatedly, many participants felt a sense of loss. And if you go back to the chart, this was the middle section of our findings chart. So a lot of workers commented they felt a sense of loss for who they used to be, and they knew that they could not be that worker again. And for a lot of people, they had their competency constantly questioned because their coworkers also noticed the slide after MS became more acute. So this is a big issue. It made a lot of people question their own self-efficacy. It made people withdraw to some extent. And it made some people actually quit their job because they didn't feel like they were the worker that they used to be, and they didn't feel like it was worthwhile to go on. A lot of them even considered jobs far outside their careers. We had one individual, for example, who was a healthcare management professional, and she started looking for jobs as a cashier. Even though she didn't feel like she was qualified for cashier jobs because she had never done it before, she didn't feel as though she was qualified any longer to do healthcare management, so she was looking for something more entry level. And this could be part of what results in that $440 a week figure that we got from the RSA 911 database. Okay, again, here's some quotes. I mean, looking for a job is difficult enough, and I think people with MS put so much added pressure on ourselves because of the worker we used to be. I think it's a very difficult process psychiatrically because it can be very depressing, it can be very frustrating, okay? We heard this theme over and over and over again, that many of our participants had other mental health issues, depression, anxiety, because they just could not reconcile the fact that their job performance could not be what it once was because of the declines based on their MS. And also, I would add, because their employers were unable to accommodate their changing needs. So we hear this a lot, that there's a lot of pressure with job seeking, and that pressure and the repeated failures can definitely result in feelings of inadequacy and even to depression sometimes. That's been the hardest part for me, is the fact that employers don't want to come out and say it, but you can feel it. You can see it when you go on interviews. You try real hard not to show that your right leg is carrying itself, you know? So we heard this a couple of times too, that interviews were particularly difficult for our participants. They felt that they could get in the door with strong employment history and with really good resumes and experience. But they felt that when they got to the interview, that's where the door shut, because it's hard to get through an interview without showing some of your physical symptoms. If you're a person with MS who has cognitive difficulties as well, it's very, very hard to get through an interview without showing some of those cognitive difficulties with processing questions, that sort of thing. So many of our participants, especially those who are unemployed, felt like their job prospects always ended at the interview stage. And then finally here, I'm looking for more entry-level jobs, maybe like a cashier or something like that. And I can't get hired for that because of my past experiences, unless I lie and say I did that before. So this is the conundrum that many people faced. A lot of our participants, especially those who are employed, but some of those who are unemployed as well, had previous careers as professionals. They had advanced degrees, they worked in accounting or journalism, and reconciling that with taking an entry-level job as a cashier or something like that was both emotionally taxing for them, but also presented many barriers because they had worked their whole career in higher level work, and employers tend not to take you seriously if you're used to higher level work and then apply for an entry level job. So this was a big barrier as well. So finally, our last major code of the 3 codes is probably more in line with what is experienced by people with other physical disabilities based on our larger research project, our findings so far. Whereas the first 2 were really quite unique to MS and very unique in their rooting in kind of dealing with the emotional toll of physical disability. The stuff about navigating the workplace is fairly common to many other physical disabilities. So a lot of what we heard from participants was about their ability to ask for accommodations. This was a huge issue. These were largely people who had worked their entire careers very independently and had been very successful in their careers without what they considered to be special treatments. So having to ask for accommodations, even though that's your right in the workplace, was very difficult for them. A lot of them considered it to be getting special treatment, or some of them considered it to be kind of admitting defeat in a way. And so we'll have some quotes to illustrate that in a moment. And many of them really saw it as a form of stigma. I remember, I don't think I'm sharing the quote with you on the next slide, But there was one person who was talking about her visual impairment as a result of MS, and that she needed a larger computer monitor. And she really found that asking for that created some stigma because not everyone in her office gets the big monitor. That was really a special thing. For her, it was necessary to work. For most people, it was just something that they wanted. Also, this is really common to many other forms of disability that we've studied. Many people with MS were very, very concerned about losing their benefits, whether that be SSDI or home health or what have you. And that made several of the participants, especially those who are unemployed, make the choice to not work so they could be assured of their benefits. So a few quotes. This top one I think is really quite good, and I think it really provides some food for thought for employers and VR counselors as well as people with MS. So this participant, I was a journalist, so I worked in TV and radio and in newspapers, and the best was being able to get out there and find the story. I just can't do that anymore. I really can't get out. But over time, I became sort of the editor, and I could sit at my desk and read the stories written by other people. So this is a great example of how you can carve out specific job duties for people with MS in this case that really work for them and that work for the employer as well. I'm sure the employer loves having someone who will just sit and edit. So it keeps the person in their chosen field where they can be most valuable, and it works for the employer too, and we need a lot more solutions like this. Another example that's not so positive. I was at a job once at a luxury car dealership, and they got a new site, and I was so excited. We're going to go over there, and we did. It was all stairs, and I couldn't stay. I tried. I always try, but it didn't work out for that reason, right? So here's an example of where accommodations just couldn't work, right? If a car dealership has tons of stairs and you cannot handle the stairs, it's going to be really hard to be accommodated in that. Even with barrier-free access laws and that sort of thing, we all know that sometimes those entrances are on the side or kind of out of the way, and that's just not conducive to selling a luxury vehicle. So this individual had to pass up one of their dream jobs because they just couldn't handle the physical environment. And then finally over here on the right, right now I can't give up my disability benefits. I can't take that risk. That's very simple to the point, but very, very indicative of the feelings of many of our participants. Okay, so I want to help put some of this in context quickly. There's a lot of other potential implications that I won't go over, but I want to start to put everything in context for you so you can start to think about how you might apply this to your own work or your own life. So first, quickly on study limitations, as with any research, we do have some limitations to this study. First of all, on our recruitment limitations, we really don't know where our people came from. We had several potential referral sources, but we didn't track who sent which participant. So we actually don't exactly know who our participants really are and how representative they are of the national population in terms of their overall placement within advocacy organizations and the like. We do know that most of the participants in the MS studies did have some connection to advocacy organizations. They talked a lot about how important the MS Society was in their life, mostly the local chapters. So I think that's important, but it's also a limitation because many people with MS don't have those connections, and it means that our participants were somewhat different, most likely than the population of people with MS at large. On the side of strengths, we did have a very, very wide array of participants, and I think that speaks very, very well to the quality of our findings. I think we were very representative. This kind of study is never, ever generalizable. Excuse me. This kind of study is never ever generalizable, but we do feel like this is a relatively honest and representative group of participants, which is a very difficult thing to do in qualitative research. We also feel that given that we did the interviews telephonically, that our participants, particularly the participants with MS, were extremely open to us. They shared some very difficult things to talk about with us. They were very open. They played off each other's comments and didn't rely on the facilitator to drive the conversation. We had very rich conversations, and I think that also contributes to the strength of our findings. In terms of future research, we do have a survey coming out. The main objective of this qualitative study was to inform the questions that went into our quantitative study, our survey, and I will talk about that a little bit more in just a couple minutes. Okay, so some food for thought that's come out of this for us. The first thing is that we really need to, for people with MS, address their changing needs. MS is constantly changing for many people, and that means that our approach to helping people with MS find employment needs to constantly change with them. As I've mentioned several times, the emotional toll of MS is relatively unique compared to other disability groups that we've studied. So we really feel like we need to embrace the emotional things that people with MS struggle with sometimes. And we need to understand how those emotional challenges play into their employment outcomes and their potential for employment. So I think this is particularly important for professionals, perhaps especially voc rehab professionals, is that we really need to understand the entire person in their environment as they are today, and how they perceive they'll be tomorrow, and how they perceive themselves 10 years ago. All these things play in to how we can help a person with MS find successful employment. So we really need to understand the whole person if we're to come up with successful job outcomes. This may be particularly important for MS, even compared to other disability groups. So it's something I think really to take to heart. Next, people with MS, as we know, have very individualized needs. So, and we know that sometimes they've felt big challenges to their sense of self-confidence, and they've had their competency challenged by their peers. So one of our jobs as an employer, as a person with MS, as a voc rehab counselor, needs to be finding competency. Even after some decline, people with MS still have many strengths, and those strengths are very individualized to the person. And if we can find ways to harness those strengths within the workplace, then we can come to much better employment outcomes. So the example of job carving that I shared earlier on, the quotes of the journalist, that's a perfect example. And those sorts of things can happen in most any workplace. And I think we need to challenge ourselves to be much more progressive and much more thoughtful about how we can make that happen, so that it's a win-win both for the employer and the employee. So finally, for people with MS, it's a big transition to going from, as we've heard from some of our participants, the worker that you were to the worker that you will be. It's a major transition. And oftentimes that transition takes a good bit of advocacy in the workplace. And this is new to most people. As I alluded to before, requests to telework, to use assistive devices, to get a larger monitor, to get a restroom retrofit. All these things are, they're difficult to ask for. They're new things to advocate on behalf of yourself. But they're not special favors. They're your right. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you're entitled to reasonable accommodations. And your employer is required to make reasonable accommodations in most cases. So we would really advocate for people with MS to connect with advocates. The MS Society gets great reviews, but connect with them and learn how to advocate for yourself in the workplace, learn how to request accommodations, learn what your rights are. It's not special treatment, it's your right. And so we'd really recommend that you connect with great advocacy organizations such as the MS Society so that you can really optimize your skills in the workplace. All right, that brings us towards the end. This is the most exciting slide on the entire presentation. This is our funding note. Our study was funded by NIDLR. There's the funding number if you like it. And one other very important thing. We are now embarking on a national survey study of employment for people with physical disabilities, and we would cordially invite you to participate in it, and we would very much like you to encourage people you know to participate in it. So it's a national survey along the very same lines, very similar lines of questioning as what we saw in today's presentation. It's open to anyone with physical disabilities, doesn't matter, SCI, MS, cerebral palsy, arthritis, any other physical disability. And you can reach more information on it via this link, which is also linked through this webpage directly. So we really hope you'll take the time to follow up on that. We're hoping to get a very good response rate so we can really say that we're representing people with physical disabilities and their needs for employment supports as thoroughly as possible. So please encourage people to take part yourself if you have a physical disability. And thank you very much for your time in watching this. Thank you very much for your support in checking out the survey. And we hope to see you again on another one of these webcasts soon. Thank you.